Alright, so today we'll be testing the GTX 970 in Warzone 2. Just going over our settings here. We are running at 1080p at the moment. The quality preset is set to basic, and we've got 100% render resolution. We've got now upscaling. This card does not support DLSS, but we do have a few other options which we'll try if we can't get our required frame rate. And there's the rest of the settings here, and I just want to so motion blur is disabled. Alright, so we've got NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency on plus boost. We're just going to set that to on, as that is the default. Alright, so we're in the plane and we are getting about 70 frames per second. You can see that in the top left hand corner there we've got our GPU metrics, the temperature, the usage, the core clock speed, the power draw, and the voltage. Then we've got the VRAM usage and the memory clock speed, as well as our CPU temperature, usage, and clock speed. We've got our DDR4 30 to 100 megahertz memory there listed as well. 16 gigabytes of memory I've got installed on this system. And as you can see, we're getting about 60 frames per second currently. I'm just going to drop here at the villager. There's an abandoned ship here, and that's where I'm going to be starting my benchmark run. Now, I usually test with a 12700K, but for these lower end GPUs or these older GPUs, I'm just going to use the 12400F because we shouldn't be running into any CPU bottlenecks when using older cards like this. Right, so over here we're getting between 50 and 80 frames per second. The reason for that is the water in this game is actually very intensive. It's pretty expensive to render, and that is because the water detail is actually very nice in this game. Not with these exact settings, but as you can see, if we look at the water, we are getting about 30 frames per second. That's not ideal. We look this way and we get about 70 frames per second. So it's definitely not a constant 60 frames per second experience. And these dips will definitely cost you in the middle of a gunfight. Nobody wants their frames per second to halve during a gunfight. And if your frames per second actually halve, then you'll die like me. Let's just blame it on the frame rate, but your input latency then also increases quite a lot. Right, so as you can see here, we are getting 40 frames per second in the water, and that's definitely not ideal. So I'm just going to try and run away here. Okay, we can't enter that building. We shouldn't be able to enter this one either. Just going to try and hide away and get some armor. But let's just start our benchmark run here. Now we can actually see the lows and the 0.1% lows as well. And as you can see, we've got the frame time graph at the bottom there as well. And that would show us if we have any major stuttering going on. I'm not even going to try and attempt the sniper rifle. That would just be suicide. Alright, so this is just exiting the water now. You can see our average is about 50 frames per second, and that should increase now once we get a little bit further inland, and immediately we are up into the 70s. That's a major drop in the frame rate, purely just because of water. So if you've got a 970 and you plan on playing at 1080p with no upscaling, then just try and stay away from any water. All right, we've been running around for about 2 minutes inland here, and as you can see, the frame rate average actually climbed quite a bit. It does drop to about 60 frames per second when there's a lot to render in the distance, but all in all, it's actually not terrible when you are away from water. And there's an enemy UAV, so maybe I'll just hide and adjust the graphical settings a bit. So as you can see, we've got an average of about 64 frames per second, and let's see what we can do at 1440p. Right, I've got all the other settings still exactly the same. It's the basic preset, and now we are just on a 1440p, and our render resolution should still be at 100. Just going to reset these numbers here, and you can see that we are getting about 40 frames per second. So we lost about between 20 and 30 frames per second by going one resolution higher. Not that I'm saying that you should play this game with a 970 at 1440p. It's barely consistently playing at 60 frames per second at 1080p. But as with our previous benchmarks, we go through different resolutions just to show you what the GPU is capable of. It's also unfair to expect this GPU to perform well on this title at these settings. I mean, it is an 8-year-old GPU, and this game was released about 2 weeks ago. So that's a whole 8-year difference between the game and the GPU launching, and I survived my contract. There we go. Then I can level up some weapons without actually doing anything. Alright, so there you have it. At 1440p we got an average of about 46 frames per second. Interestingly, the lows are actually pretty respectable. I mean, in comparison with the average, not that you would be happy with the 20 frames per second, 0.1% low, but in all honesty, I actually expected a little bit worse. Right, so now we've done 1440p, and let's see what this card can do at 4K. I'm actually not sure if this card will allow us to go to 4K, purely because of the VRAM. Even though this card is advertised as having 4 gigs of VRAM, it's actually 3.5 usable, but let's see what happens. Right, so our numbers there in the top left hand corner actually shrunk quite a bit. That's just because the on-screen display overlay scales with your resolution, but it should still be visible, and we're just going to reset them, and you can see that we are getting about 26 frames per second. The CPU usage is very low, and that's because we are extremely GPU bound at this resolution with this card. You'll be GPU bound with most graphics cards at this resolution, so it's definitely no surprise. Just going to try and get away from the gas here. The input latency is actually terrible. I can't even open up my parachute in time. And you can see in the water we are getting about 15 frames per second. So definitely not ideal. And it's not like the water is looking spectacular here. It's pretty average looking water at these settings. The reflections actually look quite nice. But that's about it. And I think we might not make it to the safe zone. Alright, so I'm just going to try and make it to the safe zone. Luckily, we're not too far away. Whether we make it there alive is a different story. But as soon as I'm there, we'll just lower the graphical settings a bit and see if we can get at least a decent frame rate to be somewhat competitive in this title. Right, I think we're safe here. So at 4K, we got an average of 23 frames per second, and now you can actually see that our lows are dipped quite a lot, and I assume that's because we are running out of VRAM. But let's see what we can do at 1080p with some upscaling technologies. And we actually got into the middle of a fight here. I thought we would be safe, but I guess not. And we actually got 2 kills, and that was just in the middle of changing the graphical settings. So you can definitely get some kills even with this GPU. We've got 20 seconds before the gas starts moving in again. So I'm just going to try and make a run for it again. And this is now at 1080p, but I haven't enabled any upscaling tech. I haven't had the chance yet to do that. It's almost like people want to win this game rather than just have me benchmark it. Right, but I think we should be safe-ish, yeah? And let's see what we can do with some upscaling tech. So this game actually supports Intel XeSS, which is Intel's upscaling technology similar to FSR. Then NVIDIA image scaling is a driver-side upscaling technology. It does not rely on tensor cores like DLSS does. And then AMD FSR is obviously AMD's upscaling tech. And I think for compatibility, I'm just going to use FSR. This is only version 1, which is pretty strange. But let's see what we can do at the balanced preset here. Right, so we just reset our numbers, and you can see we are getting above 100 frames per second here. The game doesn't look too great, lots of shimmering, especially in objects that have some type of mesh, like this security gate here and the goal net over there. And especially in the distance, you'll also see it quite a lot. Right, but if you do have a 970 and you want to play Warzone, then it's definitely playable with these settings. I would say that 100 frames per second in this game is enough to be enjoyable, not to be frustrating when it comes to input lag and missing all of your shots. You might not see the enemies in the distance due to all the shimmering and artifacting, but at least you'll be playing at about 100 frames per second. Right, so looking in the distance here, you can see that it does drop a little bit, but overall, it's definitely not bad. It'll be actually pretty funny if we actually win this game whilst benchmarking. Right, so an average of 112 frames per second with FSR balanced. So I'm just going to increase the FSR setting to performance, and let's see if we can get our 120 frames per second here. And we died just as we did that. But we didn't gain anything from jumping to FSR Performance. We managed to survive the gulag just purely because there was nobody left to fight. But I'll take that as a win. We are in the top 15 at the moment. I mean, it's not bad considering we're not really trying. I actually perform better than what I do when I do try. So maybe I should just, in future, if I want to play competitively, I should just run benchmarks.
25 remain.
Or not. And there you have it. So we've got an average of about 114 frames per second with FSR on performance. It's pretty much the same as what we had on FSR balanced. So if you have to play this game with this GPU, I suggest you play at 1080p with FSR balanced, and you should get a pretty decent experience. The graphics might leave you wanting for more, but then again, these online shooters aren't really all about the graphics. As long as you can see your opponent and you've got a decent frame rate or a consistent frame rate, it's actually a little bit more important, you should be fine. Alright, and that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.